The night was so cold it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting to die. Snow didn't fall, it hung in the air, a frozen fog that bit at your skin and stole the sound from the trees. Through this dead white silence walked a woman named Clara May Callahan, and she was carrying the only three things she had left in the world. Her daughters. Lyra Rose, the oldest, tried to be brave, her little legs pumping through drifts that came up to her waist. June, her face a pale moon, just stared ahead, too scared to even blink. And little Pearl, just 4 years old, was a trembling bundle in Clara's arms, her breath a tiny, fragile cloud. Behind them was a town full of closed doors and mean whispers. In front of them, nothing. Just miles of dark woods and a cold that wanted to get inside their bones and stop their hearts for good. The townfolk said she was cursed. When her husband, Thomas, died in a sawmill accident, the talk started. They said she'd been with other men. They said she brought ruin. They'd let her scrub their floors for pennies, but when the real cold hit, their charity froze solid. The merchant's wife, her face pinched and sour, had told her straight, "We have our own mouths to feed. Your bad luck isn't welcome here." So Clara walked. She walked until her feet were numb and her arms screamed. She walked until the hope inside her was just a tiny flickering ember. She slipped on a patch of ice and went down hard, the snow like a punch to the gut. Little Pearl almost flew from her arms. Clara scrambled up, a raw sound tearing from her throat, refusing to give up. Not yet. And that's when she saw it. Through the shifting curtain of snow, a wisp of smoke, thin and grey against the black trees. A cabin. It was a ghost of a chance, but it was the only one she had. She hesitated. She knew who lived there. The whole town knew. Silas Boone. A name they spoke like a curse, a giant of a man, they said, with fists like rocks and a temper like a forest fire. He'd lived in town once, years ago. But after his young wife died, bringing their child into the world, something in him broke. He'd walked into these mountains and never came back. Some said he drank himself into a rage most nights. Others whispered he'd lost his mind and fought bears for sport. To Clara, he was just a story, a monster in the dark. But desperation is a hard master. It pushes you toward things you'd normally run from. She stumbled to the door, the wood rough and cold beneath her knuckles. She raised her fist and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the massive silence of the woods. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Just the wind whining through the pines. Then a sound from inside, a heavy boot on a wood floor, a bolt being drawn, the door creaked open, and a slice of warm orange light fell across the snow. He stood there, filling the entire doorway, a mountain carved from shadow and rage. His hair was a wild black mess, his jaw was covered in a thick beard, and in his hand, held loosely but ready, was an axe. His eyes, grey as a winter storm, swept over her, then down to the three little girls huddled behind her skirts, shivering in the moonlight. Clara's voice was a broken whisper. "Please," she begged, "just for one night. Shelter. Until the morning." Silas Boone didn't say a word. He just stared, his face a mask of stone. His gaze flicked from one child to the next, taking in their blue lips, their hollow cheeks. Clara could feel his judgment, and she braced herself for the door to slam shut, leaving them to the mercy of the cold. The muscle in his jaw twitched. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough from not being used. "The town send you." Clara couldn't meet his eyes. Shame burned her cheeks. "The town sent us away," she said, her voice barely audible. Behind her, little Pearl let out a weak, rattling cough. It was a tiny sound, but in the dead quiet of the night it sounded like a hammer blow. The axe in Silas's hand lowered just an inch. He took a breath, a long, slow one that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then he did something she never expected. He stepped aside. Inside, he grunted. The cabin was one room, rough and simple, but the fire in the hearth was a roaring beast, chasing the cold into the corners. It smelled of pine and wood smoke and dried pelts that hung from the rafters. Silas didn't look at them, he just pointed a thick finger toward the fire. Clara herded her girls close, her own body trembling with relief. She peeled off their damp shawls, rubbing their frozen hands, holding them out to the wonderful life-giving heat. Sighs of pure bliss escaped their lips. From a shelf, Silas took down a loaf of dark bread. He sawed off thick slices with a hunting knife and slapped them onto tin plates, setting them on the scarred wooden table. The girls didn't need to be told twice. They fell on the food like hungry wolves, their small hands shaking as they stuffed the bread into their mouths. Clara watched, her own stomach a hollow ache, but she wouldn't eat until her girls had their fill. Silas saw it. He didn't say anything, just cut another slice and pushed the plate toward her. Her hand trembled as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. He just grunted in response, turning his back on them to go sit at his workbench. The night wore on. Outside, the wind howled, throwing handfuls of snow against the shutters. The girls, their bellies finally full, curled up together on a bearskin rug near the fire and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. But Clara couldn't rest. She sat bolt upright on a small stool, every muscle tense, watching the man in the corner. Silas sat in his chair, sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shlick of stone on steel was the only sound besides the fire and the storm. His eyes kept flicking over to her, his gaze unsettling. She knew he was a man who had chosen to be alone. Her presence here, with her 3 children, was an invasion. It was a crack in the armor of silence he had built around himself. She knew she couldn't stay. One night. That's what she'd asked for, but listening to the storm rage outside, she wondered if they would even survive another day out in that wilderness. What would morning bring? Would he throw them back out into the snow when the sun came up? Her eyes drifted over him. She saw his scarred, powerful hands, the broad slope of his shoulders, the deep lines of loneliness carved into his face. He was the monster the town whispered about, yes, but he was also the man who had given her children food, the man who had shared his fire. He set the knife down, the sudden silence making her jump. He stood, his shadow swallowing the room, and placed another thick log on the fire. Flames leaped up, painting the cabin in a warm, dancing light. For the first time, their eyes met across the room. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the silence, something passed between them. Not kindness, not pity. Something else, something she couldn't name. She had knocked on a monster's door, and he had let her in. But as the storm screamed and the fire crackled, a cold dread tightened its grip on her heart. She didn't know if she'd stumbled into salvation or a trap far worse than the winter outside. The first hint of morning was a pale grey light seeping through the cracks in the shutters. It found the 3 little girls sleeping in a tangle of limbs on the floor, their faces peaceful in the dimness. Clara woke with a start, her neck stiff, her eyes gritty with exhaustion. She'd been sitting on that stool all night, too afraid to sleep. Her first thought was to get out, to gather her daughters and be gone before Silas Boone woke up. She had asked for one night, and she wouldn't push his charity, whatever it was. But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. The room spun, her vision going black at the edges. She fell back onto the stool with a sharp gasp. The sound woke him. His eyes snapped open, grey and cold as a frozen lake. He was still in his chair, a heavy blanket pulled over him, but one hand rested on the hilt of the knife on his belt. Even asleep, he was on guard. He watched her for a long moment, his face giving nothing away. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. He was going to tell them to leave. But he didn't. Wordlessly, he stood up, took a heavy iron kettle from its hook, and went to the door. He scooped it full of clean snow and set it on a hook over the fire to melt. The gesture was simple, but it hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. He was making water. He wasn't throwing them out. Not yet. The storm had buried the world. For days, the snow kept falling, piling up in massive drifts, cutting the cabin off from everything. It became their whole world. A strange rhythm began to form in that small, rough room. Clara, grateful for the shelter, made herself useful. She found a needle and thread in a small box and mended the children's torn clothes. She cooked when Silas brought in food, stretching what little they had to make a thin but hot stew. Silas was a ghost. He would disappear into the white forest for hours, moving like a shadow, and return with a rabbit or a brace of squirrels. His beard crusted with ice, his eyes unreadable. He rarely spoke, but the girls, children that they were, started to thaw before he did. Liar Rose would watch him skin a rabbit with a mix of fascination and horror. June would trail behind him as he split firewood, her small face serious. One evening, little Pearl, who feared nothing, toddled over to where he sat, reached up and gave his thick beard a curious tug. Clara gasped, ready to snatch her back. But a strange sound rumbled up from Silas's chest. It was a laugh, a rusty, cracked sound, like an old engine turning over for the first time in years. It startled everyone, including Silas himself. Clara started to notice small things. The way he always gave the best pieces of meat to the children. The way he moved his own wet boots away from the hearth to make room for their tiny, worn-out shoes. His actions were his words, and they were slowly, carefully, learning a new language. But the world outside hadn't forgotten them. Somehow, word got back to town. The widow Callahan and her girls were shacked up with the mountain man, Silas Boone. The gossip spread like a disease. She'd sold herself to the beast for a roof over her head, they whispered. He'd taken her in for his own dark reasons, they hissed. Clara felt their judgment like a physical weight. One day, the snow let up enough for Silas to need supplies. He was going to town to trade some furs. To her own surprise, she insisted on going with him. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't let her daughters think she was ashamed. The walk into town was a nightmare. Every eye was on them. Women pulled their children away as they passed. Men stopped talking and just stared, their faces a mixture of contempt and cruel curiosity. One man, a merchant she used to clean for, spat on the ground near her feet. Clara's face burned with humiliation, but she lifted her chin higher. Silas didn't say a word, but he shifted, placing his body slightly between her and the men. The look in his eyes was like a drawn blade, and no one dared to do more than stare. That night, back in the quiet of the cabin, an unspoken bond was forged. She was mending one of her husband Thomas's old coats by the firelight, trying to patch a hole in the sleeve. Her fingers were clumsy, still stiff from the cold. As she turned the coat over, her hand brushed against something hard and strangely shaped, sewn deep into the lining of the collar. It wasn't a button. Curious, she worked the threads loose with her teeth. A small object fell into her palm. It was a bird, carved from a dark, smooth piece of wood. It was beautifully made, every feather detailed, its head cocked as if listening for a sound. It was a lovely, simple thing. A trinket Thomas must have carried for luck. She held it up to the light, smiling faintly. "Look what I found," she said, more to herself than to Silas. "Thomas must have." She never finished the sentence. Across the room, Silas had gone perfectly still. The knife he was cleaning fell from his hand and clattered onto the floor. He stared at the wooden bird in her hand, and all the warmth drained from the room. His face, which had slowly been softening over the past weeks, hardened back into a mask of stone. But this time there was something else in his eyes. Something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his presence overwhelming. He didn't just look at the bird, he looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and he didn't like what he saw. He reached out and snatched the bird from her palm, his rough fingers brushing hers. The touch was like a jolt of ice. "Where?" he growled, his voice a low, dangerous thing she had never heard before. "Did you get this?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as the axe by the door. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the quiet, gruff man who gave her children food. This was the monster from the stories. "It was my husband's," she stammered, shrinking back. "It was sewn into his coat. It's just a carving, a trinket." "No," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "It's not." He turned the bird over and over in his massive hand, his thumb tracing its smooth lines. He looked from the bird to her face, his eyes narrowed with a suspicion that made her feel sick. "I knew Thomas Callahan," he said softly, and the words sent a chill down her spine. "He wasn't the man you thought he was." Before Clara could even begin to process what that meant, a new sound cut through the night. The sound of horses. Not one, but several, moving fast, their hooves crunching on the packed snow. Silas's head snapped up. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The muscles in his back went rigid. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tight, "and don't make a sound." He shoved the wooden bird deep into his pocket and grabbed his heavy coat. He didn't take the axe. He took the long hunting rifle that rested above the fireplace. He checked the load, his movements quick and sure. Then he went to the door and waited. A heavy fist pounded on the wood. "Boone, we know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding." Silas opened the door. 3 men stood there, their faces harsh in the lantern light they carried. They were men from town, but the one in front wasn't just some random drunk. It was Mr. Abernathy, the man who owned the sawmill. The richest, most powerful man in the county. The man who had sneered at her when she begged for credit at his store just a month ago. Abernathy's cold eyes looked past Silas and fixed on Clara. "There you are, widow," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "We've come to collect on your husband's debts." "She has nothing," Silas said, his body blocking the doorway. "Her debts are her own. You'll deal with me." Abernathy laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, I don't think you understand, Boone. We're not here for money." His eyes flicked around the cabin, then landed back on Silas. "Thomas made us a promise before his unfortunate accident. He was holding something for us, something valuable. We think he might have passed it along to his loving wife." He paused, his smile widening. "Something small, something you could hide easily, maybe something carved." Clara's blood ran cold. It wasn't about debts. It wasn't about her staying with Silas. It was about the bird. These powerful men had ridden up here in the middle of the night for a little wooden bird. What was it? What had her husband gotten himself into? Silas didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice level. "The woman is under my protection. The trail is closed. Leave." Abernathy's eyes narrowed into slits. He stared at Silas for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. He clearly didn't believe a word. But Silas stood there, immovable as an old oak tree, the long rifle held loosely in his hands. "This isn't over, Boone," Abernathy snarled. "You can't hide up here forever. We'll be back. And when we come back, we won't be knocking." The 3 men turned, mounted their horses, and galloped away, their angry shouts swallowed by the darkness. Silas closed the door and bolted it. The silence in the cabin was suddenly suffocating. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. Her husband, the sawmill owner, a hidden valuable object. Nothing made sense. She backed away from him, her hand flying to her mouth. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What was all that about? What did my husband do?" Silas turned from the door, his face grim in the firelight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird. He didn't look at it. He looked at her, and the guarded expression was gone. In its place was a look of deep, weary sorrow. "Your husband," he said, his voice heavy with a truth he'd clearly kept buried for a very long time, "was a thief, and this little bird is the key to where he hid the gold." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Thief, gold. It was impossible. Thomas had been a simple man, a sawmill worker. He was kind. He was gentle. He loved her. He couldn't. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying. He wasn't like that." "He was," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "A year ago, a stagecoach carrying a payroll for the railroad was robbed. It was clean, no witnesses. The gold just vanished." He finally looked down at the bird in his hand. "Abernathy planned it. He brought in your husband and 2 other men. Their mistake was trusting Thomas to hold the stash until things cooled down. Thomas got greedy. He took the gold for himself and vanished from their crew." Clara sank onto the stool, her legs refusing to hold her. The world was tilting, the floor falling away beneath her. The whispers in town, the way people had looked at her after Thomas died. It wasn't just because she was a widow. They suspected something. The accident, she breathed, the horrific realization dawning on her. The sawmill. It wasn't an accident, was it? Silas's silence was her answer. Abernathy hadn't just been sending a message. He'd been tying up a loose end. He'd killed her husband. And now he thought she knew where the stolen gold was. Her and her 3 little girls were in the middle of a secret war between violent, greedy men. She looked up at Silas, a new terror gripping her. "And you? How do you know all this? Were you part of it?" "No," he said, and for the first time she heard a raw, bitter anger in his voice. I wasn't. Thomas. He was my friend once, a long time ago. I tried to warn him. I told him Abernathy was poison. I told him to walk away before it was too late. He clenched his fist around the wooden bird, his knuckles white. He didn't listen. Now it made sense, the way Silas had looked at her that first night. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. He knew who she was. He knew whose wife and children had shown up at his door. He had let them in, not out of charity, but out of a debt he felt he owed to the friend he couldn't save. The fragile safety of the cabin was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. Abernathy would be back. He wouldn't give up. He would tear the cabin apart. He would hurt her. He would hurt her children to get what he wanted. They were trapped. Clara looked at her sleeping daughters, their innocent faces so peaceful by the firelight. A fierce, protective rage she had never felt before burned away her fear. Her husband had made a terrible mistake. He had left her with a legacy of shame and danger, but she would not let his mistakes destroy her children. She stood up, her back straight, her chin high. She looked Silas Boone square in the eye. "What does this bird do?" she asked, her voice steady now, hard as ice. "How is it a key?" A flicker of surprise, maybe even respect, showed in his eyes. He walked to the heavy wooden table and set the bird down. "It's not a key," he said, "it's a map." He pressed a small, almost invisible notch on the bird's wing. With a soft click, the bird split in half along a hidden seam. It wasn't solid. It was a locket. But inside there was no picture. Instead, etched into the dark wood was a series of strange symbols and lines. It looked like nonsense. A child scratching. "I don't understand," Clara said. "Neither did Abernathy," Silas replied. "That's why he couldn't find the gold after he killed Thomas. Your husband was clever. It's a code. And only someone who knew him, who knew how his mind worked, would be able to read it." He looked from the strange map to Clara's face. "He made it for you, in case something happened to him. He must have intended for you to find it." Clara stared at the markings. Her mind, numb with shock just moments before, began to race. Thomas had loved puzzles, riddles. He was always carving little things, leaving her notes in secret places. It was their game, these symbols. She looked closer. One of them was a rough circle with a cross, the brand they used for logs at the old mill. Another was a shape like a bent nail. He'd always joked about the crooked nail on the church steeple. It wasn't just a code, it was a map made of their shared memories. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. Abernathy had murdered her husband, cast her and her children out to die, and was now hunting them for money that was soaked in blood. She would not run. She would not hide. "We have to find it," she said, her voice low and determined. "Before he does." Silas looked at her, a long, searching look. He saw the grief in her eyes, but underneath it he saw a core of steel he hadn't expected. He saw a mother who would burn the world down to protect her children. He nodded slowly. "Abernathy thinks we're hiding," he said. "He thinks we're scared. He'll be back, and he'll bring more men. We don't have much time." He looked at the map, then back at her. "But he won't expect us to go on the attack. He won't expect us to go after the gold ourselves." A wild, desperate plan began to form. It was insane. It was suicidal. But it was the only move they had left. They weren't going to wait for the wolf to come to the door. They were going to walk right into his den. The map wasn't simple. It was a chain of riddles. The crooked nail on the church steeple, the old oak tree struck by lightning. Each clue led to the next, a trail of memories only she could follow. And as they deciphered it, a shocking picture emerged. The gold wasn't buried deep in the woods. It wasn't hidden in some remote cave. Thomas, in a move of stunning audacity, had hidden it right under their noses. The final clue pointed to the town itself, to the base of the stone monument in the town square, a memorial to the town's founding fathers. It was the last place anyone would think to look, a place so public, so respected, that it was perfectly hidden in plain sight. The plan was terrifying. They would have to sneak into town, in the dead of night, and dig up the gold while the entire town slept, including the man who would kill them to get it. The night they chose was moonless, the sky a blanket of thick grey clouds. Silas left the girls with a store of food and wood, telling them to bolt the door and open it for no one. Lyra rose, her eyes wide with fear, but her jaw set with a bravery that mirrored her mother's, nodded solemnly. "We'll be safe, Ma," she promised. The journey to town was a nerve-shredding ordeal. They moved through the trees like ghosts, every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Clara's veins. Silas was completely at home in the darkness. He moved with a silent, deadly grace that was both comforting and terrifying. They reached the edge of town and waited in the shadows, watching the lights in the windows go out one by one. The silence that fell was different from the silence of the woods. It was a watchful, sleeping silence, full of hidden dangers. "Ready?" Silas whispered, his voice a low breath beside her. Clara nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. They moved quickly, keeping to the alleys, their feet silent on the hard-packed dirt. The town square was empty, a ghost of itself in the dim starlight. The monument stood in the center, a dark, hulking shape. It felt like they were robbing a grave. Silas had brought tools, a small shovel and a pry bar. While Clara stood watch, her eyes scanning the dark windows of the buildings around the square, he began to work at the base of the statue. There was a loose flagstone, just as Thomas's riddle had implied. The sound of the stone grating as he pried it up was deafening in the silence. Beneath it was packed earth. He began to dig. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every second, Clara expected to hear a shout, to see a light flare in a window. Her body was coiled tight as a spring. Then the shovel hit something hard with a dull thunk. Silas reached into the hole and pulled out a heavy iron lockbox, crusted with dirt. It was small, but incredibly heavy. This was it. The price of her husband's life, the reason she and her daughters were freezing in a mountain cabin. A voice cut through the darkness, smooth as silk and cold as death. "I knew you'd be smart enough to figure it out, widow. I was counting on it." Clara spun around. Mr. Abernathy stepped out of the shadows of the mercantile porch. He wasn't alone. His two thugs were with him, and all three of them were holding rifles. They had been waiting. It was a trap. "Thank you for doing the heavy lifting," Abernathy said with a mocking smile. "Now slide the box over here. And don't even think about trying anything foolish, Boone. We've got you outnumbered." Silas slowly stood up, his hands raised in surrender. He looked calm, too calm. He glanced at Clara, a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was a signal. "It's over, Abernathy," Silas said, his voice steady. Abernathy laughed. "You're right, it is." "No," Silas said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his own face. "You don't understand. I knew you'd follow us." He raised his voice, shouting into the night. "Now!" Suddenly the night exploded. Lights flared in the windows of the sheriff's office. The doors burst open, and the town sheriff, flanked by 4 deputized men, stepped out, their own rifles leveled. Abernathy and his men were caught in a crossfire, trapped in the middle of the square. Abernathy's face went from triumph to stunned disbelief. "What is this? Sheriff, what's the meaning of this? This man is a thief." "The only thieves I see are you and your boys, Abernathy," the sheriff said, his voice hard. "Silas here rode out 2 days ago. Told me the whole ugly story, told me you'd be waiting here tonight." It had been a double trap. Silas hadn't just planned to get the gold, he'd planned to catch a murderer. He had used the gold, and themselves, as bait. But Silas wasn't finished. He took a step toward Abernathy, his eyes burning with a cold, contained fury. "This isn't just about the gold, is it, Abernathy? This is about something you took from me." Abernathy looked confused. "I never took anything from you, you crazy hermit." "My wife," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "Her name was Eleanor. She died in childbirth. That's the story everyone knows." He took another step. "But they don't know the part where you paid her a visit a week before. They don't know that you threatened her, trying to find out where Thomas was hiding. You scared her so badly, she went into early labor. The doctor said she was too weak, the stress was too much." His voice broke, just for a second, raw with a pain he had carried alone for years. "You didn't just kill Thomas Callahan. You killed my wife. You killed my son." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was never about a debt to a dead friend. For Silas, this was about vengeance, a cold, patient revenge he had been waiting years to claim. Abernathy's face went pale. He saw the truth in Silas's eyes, and he saw his entire world crumbling around him. He made a desperate move, swinging his rifle toward Silas. But it was too late. The sheriff's men swarmed him, wrestling him to the ground. The fight was over before it began. As the sheriff hauled Abernathy and his men to the jail, a profound quiet settled over the town square. The truth, dark and terrible, was finally out in the open. The stolen gold was recovered. A murderer was brought to justice. Clara looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a monster, not as a hermit, but as a man shattered by grief who had carried his own silent war for years. He had hidden his pain behind a wall of solitude, but he had never forgotten. He had waited for his moment to claim justice for the family he had lost. Weeks later, the snow had finally melted, giving way to the first green shoots of spring. The town was a different place. The story had spread like wildfire, and the shame had shifted. The whispers were no longer about the cursed widow Callahan. They were about the town's own blindness, their own cruel judgment. Clara walked down the main street, her daughters skipping ahead of her. People nodded to her now, their eyes filled with a new respect. Some even managed a shamefaced smile. Silas walked beside her, his stride steady, his presence a silent statement. They stopped on the steps of the Mercantile, the very spot where a man had once spat at her feet. He turned to her, and in the bright morning sun, he reached out and took her hand. It wasn't a gesture of ownership or even just protection. It was a partnership, a public declaration. A murmur went through the people watching, but this time it was a murmur of acceptance. Her hand fit perfectly in his. They had walked through the fire of winter, through lies and danger and the ghosts of the past. They had found each other in the darkness. She looked up at him, and in his quiet, steady gaze, she saw not the end of a long, hard road, but the beginning of a new one. Together, a family forged in secrets and sorrow, but made whole by the simple, fierce truth of standing by each other in the light. If you were moved by Clara and Silas's story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more tales that prove even in the coldest darkness, a single spark of courage can light the way home.